In 2021, The Legend of Zelda turned 35 years old, and just recently, so did I. But if there's anything the flow of time hasn't been cruel on, it's the Zelda theory community. Over the past years, Nintendo's willingness to communicate and share information with the fans has been better than ever before, and in the grander scheme of things, this is still a fairly recent development. It's easy to forget that for the majority of Zelda history, Nintendo wasn't exactly diligent in explaining the overarching story and lore of the series. Now, some games were clearly meant to be connected, the earliest example being Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link, a direct sequel to the original. But as more and more entries were added, it became apparent that Nintendo's priorities lie in creating interesting gameplay experiences above anything else. And nowhere is this more discernible than with the infamous Zelda timeline, which was, and to an extent still is, a subject of debate amongst the fanbase. Even though I grew up with the games, I wasn't aware of this discussion until I was already in my 20s, when the Angry Video Game Nerd made a video about it. Prior to that, I simply enjoyed playing the games and didn't really think about how they all fit together, or what the deeper meaning behind a specific location or character was. Little did I know, other fans were hard at work behind the scenes. It's hard to say when the first fan-made timelines were conceptualized. Many websites and forums from the old days no longer exist, so there's a good chance that a significant part of Zelda theory history is lost forever. I did, however, manage to find a few gems, like this timeline from North Castle, made in a time when The Wind Waker was still the hottest title, or this one from Kasudo.net, which only includes 6 games, with Majora's Mask being the newest edition. Furthermore, ZeldaUniverse.net, which is still alive and well today, has forum posts spanning all the way back to 2006, when Twilight Princess was brand new. It was a lot of fun scrubbing through these old web pages and forums, reading theories and seeing the discussions that took place at the time. It's clear that there was a lot more uncertainty and division back then, which is not surprising. At this stage, Nintendo had never released their own official take on the matter. In old interviews, Miyamoto sometimes alluded to the order of specific games that were out at the time. But not only would these statements contradict each other on some occasions, they would often change as the series moved on. When the creators themselves don't seem to be sure of themselves, it's easy to come to the conclusion that perhaps there is no rhyme or reason to all of it, and any attempts to dissect these stories or trying to fit them all together is a waste of effort. And this is kinda how things were back in the day. When it came to an official Zelda chronology, Nintendo remained mostly silent for no less than 25 years, and so the fans were left to their own devices. But everything changed when Hyrule Historia attacked. In 2011, as part of Zelda's 25th anniversary, Nintendo teamed up with Japanese publisher Shogakukan to produce an official hardcover book containing a wealth of information and artwork never before seen. It was initially only available in Japanese and wouldn't be localized for Western audiences until 2 years later. For the English localization, Nintendo approached Dark Horse Comics, an American publisher from Oregon who specialized in both the production and localization of comic books, graphic novels, manga, and other types of media. Aside from the obvious text translations, the page design itself remained virtually unchanged. However, the dimensions and cover art would be altered by Dark Horse, ditching the old design in favor of a slightly bigger green hardcover featuring the symbol of the Gate of Time from Skyward Sword. A few reasons for the change was that, first of all, by the time the English edition came out, the 25th anniversary ship had sailed, so it wouldn't make sense to keep the anniversary logo on the cover. And second, the dimensions of the Japanese version, while common in Japan, wasn't a standard for art books like these in the US, and so the whole thing was upscaled. The color green was initially chosen by Dark Horse to represent Link's iconic attire, and the Gate of Time symbol is both a nod to Skyward Sword, which is a big focus of Historia, as well as a symbolic gesture that the book offers a glimpse into the series' past, which I think is very clever. Despite the emphasis on Skyward Sword, Historia also has an entire section devoted to the chronology of the series as a whole, including the very first official Zelda timeline. After 25 years, Nintendo finally broke the silence and gave the fans their own extensive take on the Zelda universe. The book ended up being a massive success, especially in North America, taking top spots on various bestseller lists among famous titles like Harry Potter, and even knocking 50 Shades of Grey down a peg, which, I don't know, makes me feel a strong sense of justice for some reason. It would have been reasonable to expect Nintendo to go back to the silent treatment after this, but little did we know that this would be the start of a new age for Zelda fans. The book's success clearly showed that there's a high enough demand to know more about these stories. So for the 30th anniversary, Nintendo doubled down, or should I say tripled down, with even more Zelda literature. To celebrate the anniversary, Nintendo released Arts and Artifacts, also known as Hyrule Graphics in Japan, and the Legend of Zelda Encyclopedia would follow soon after, which when combined with Hyrule Historia became known as the Goddess Trilogy or Goddess Collection. Since a lot of time had passed since Historia's release, close to 6 years in fact, Encyclopedia introduced a new chronology with a few revisions. A Link Between Worlds and Triforce Heroes, which didn't exist back in 2011, were added, and Link's Awakening and the Oracle games swapped positions. As of today, this is still the most up-to-date official timeline pertaining to every mainline Zelda game but Breath of the Wild. And seeing as Eiji Onuma is reluctant to reveal the timeline placement of that game, it'll likely stay that way for quite a while. Speaking of which, as the final entry to commemorate Zelda's 30th anniversary, we got Creating a Champion, also known as Masterworks, a book solely devoted to the lore and development history of Breath of the Wild, and features its own timeline of events, with every other game having been condensed into a single era, the era of myth. With the addition of these new books, the colors red, blue and green came to represent the three golden goddesses, hence why it's known as the Goddess Trilogy, and Creating a Champion's white cover was chosen to symbolize Hylia, the fourth prominent goddess in the series lore. Well, at least for the Western editions, that is. The same consistency cannot be found in the Japanese editions, as their version of Hyrule Historia has a brown cover, so they kinda did their own thing, especially in the color department. However, the dimensions and overall look and feel of the Japanese books that followed Historia were brought in line with the North American versions. There's quite a lot of collector's editions and limited editions as well, all of which look completely different, but the ones you see here are the designs most people are familiar with. As a Zelda theorist, I adore these books. They are such a goldmine of information to draw inspiration and ideas from. Those who are familiar with my channel know that I don't shy away from taking bits and pieces to construct theories, or at the very least use them as supporting evidence to give some extra weight to them. These publications have had a significant impact on the Zelda community, most notably of course the acknowledgement of an official chronology by Nintendo, which before 2011 only seemed to exist in the minds of the fanbase. However, there's one issue which has surrounded these books ever since their inception, and that is that not everyone seems to accept them as canon, or at the very least only partially. The Encyclopedia in particular has often been criticized in this regard. The most common arguments made against their canonicity usually refer to either mistakes, inconsistencies and retcons in some of the lore, or question the involvement of those who actually made the games during the creation of the books. And it's easy to see why. I mean, Nintendo is like Area 51, very secretive, and they don't share much about what goes on behind closed doors. Pair that with a list of credits, almost none of which are members of the Zelda team, as well as a paragraph that seems to suggest that the writers interpreted the lore on their own, and you've got a solid recipe for all kinds of assumptions and doubts. When it comes to the actual content inside the books, I've always existed somewhere in the middle. Sometimes I'll use the books to add to my theories, but I've also pointed out mistakes or challenged some of the lore inside them. But in regards to Nintendo's involvement in the writing process, I've never really had a strong opinion on the matter because, frankly, I have no idea. I wasn't involved in these projects, and most likely neither were you. I think this is a topic worth exploring, most notably the part about Nintendo's involvement in the writing process. After all, context matters, and it can have a pretty significant impact on how we view Zelda canon in the future, especially if more books like these end up being in the pipeline. So for this video, I decided to dig into it. I looked at the kind of work that went into the books, the people behind their creation, both on the English and the Japanese side, and I'll also touch upon some of the counter evidence to see how they hold up. To add some extra credence to my research, I decided to contact Patrick Thorpe, senior editor at Dark Horse Comics, who together with his team was at the forefront of the English localization. You'll find his name prominently featured in all 4 books, and he has a lot of experience in publishing art books of a similar nature, like the Halo Encyclopedia and the Art of Mass Effect, for example. He was kind enough to share some of his knowledge and insights with me about the kind of work that goes into these projects on the side of the publisher. Whenever I felt unsure about something or needed something cleared up, I was able to ask questions, so suffice to say, this video wouldn't have been possible without him. We also talked extensively on video, so on some occasions I will give the stage to Patrick himself so we can hear what he has to say. So let's get into it. Now, before we get into detail about the books themselves, it's important to mention that Nintendo's licensing and official merchandising has changed a lot over the past decades. There was a time when the company's subsidiaries like Nintendo of America operated much more independently and had a lot of freedom to make their own marketing decisions. In general, the company as a whole didn't seem all too concerned with things like licensing, canonicity, and quality control. It was a bit of a free-for-all, which led to the creation of all sorts of products that are now considered as a stain on the legacy of some of Nintendo's biggest IPs. It goes without saying that this early material is not canon to the franchise. They were made under very different circumstances in a time when the company simply didn't care as much. But those days are long gone. Nowadays, every licensed product is under strict supervision of Nintendo HQ in Japan to ensure that the quality is worthy of association. Whether it's a spin-off, an official soundtrack, or a localization effort, it's all made under the watchful eye of the Japanese board of directors. This is why we haven't seen a Mario or Zelda cartoon since, and why the upcoming Mario movie is only the second attempt in close to 30 years. I guess those scars really run deep. When it comes to printed material, it's a different story, however. Even some prints from way back when are still considered canon to the series today, like the official manuals, which, in case you're interested, are still available in digital format on Nintendo's websites. The older games were somewhat limited in how much story they could tell, so oftentimes the manuals would fill in the gaps and give us more insight into the story, the world, as well as how things were supposed to look like outside the game's primitive graphics. Another case of older prints that are still considered canon are the official Nintendo Player's Guides, like the 1992 A Link to the Past guide, for example. They are canon because, well, it's official. It's published by Nintendo, has their seal of approval, has a lot of cool looking official artwork, and aside from being a strategy guide, also features quite a bit of lore exposition and backstory which isn't found in the game itself. Then there's publications that aren't canon to the Zelda timeline but are categorized as an official Nintendo licensed product, like the comic books, most notably the ones by Akira Himawaka. As amazing as these comics are, there is a good reason why most of them are not considered true to the chronology. They're often retellings of already established stories from the games, an alternate version of events, so to speak, like the story of Ocarina of Time retold. They border more on fan fiction than anything else. Still, I highly recommend giving them a read, as they are very entertaining. If you've ever wanted to see Mido get his ass kicked by Link, then this is for you. There's a lot more printed material like unofficial guides and magazines, trading cards and books which don't have any connection to Nintendo, but these are not official and thus have no bearing on the Zelda canon whatsoever. So let's move on to the main event, the Goddess Trilogy plus Creating a Champion, which I guess could be considered the Goddess Tetralogy now. It's important to note that all 4 of these books were made long after the shift in Nintendo's policy regarding marketing and merchandising. In other words, Nintendo of Japan had the final say and are also the ones who instigated these projects, hence why the Japanese editions always came out first. So, is there any substance to the claim that Nintendo's contribution to the writing process was minimal, or that the writers and editors hired for the job were given free range to insert their own headcanon into the series lore? I'm not over-exaggerating when I say that I've seen estimates of 50%, 75, 90, even 100% of the content inside having been made up by third parties. However, no one seems to explain where they got these numbers from, and without credible evidence or proper credentials to back it up, these estimates seem to be completely arbitrary. So I asked Patrick about some of the stuff that happens during the creation process and how the content exchange generally works between the licensor, in this case Nintendo, and the publisher. So let's see what he has to say.
My name is Patrick Thorpe. I'm a senior editor at Dark Horse Comics. I've been there for about 15 years, and Dark Horse does everything from art books to comic books to television shows and movies. What happens is that the licensor goes into their archives and they find any usable items, anything that they would love to get out in the world. So that includes sort of like production materials, sketch materials, backgrounds, stuff that you wouldn't normally see. Then we'll go back to the licensor and ask them what they have to say about those particular things, like whether that is Link or Princess Zelda, the Master Chief, Kratos from God of War, whatever that might be, right? What do you have to say about this particular character or this particular vehicle or what have you? And generally what happens is we either interview them and ask them about it, or we just say, we need 500 words. And, they'll shoot us back some text. And it'll be like, 400 to 500 words that we put into the book. So it comes directly from them. So when we are doing books of this nature, it's my job to present what Nintendo wants in the way that is the most true to Nintendo's intent, right? So I don't come up with any of the content for these books, right? Like our job is to present the material in the most unbiased way that we possibly can, in the most accurate way that we possibly can. And that means that we are constantly checking in with Nintendo. They're giving us the material to put in these books. We are constantly sending back what we do. As soon as we have designed a page or whatever else, we send it back to Nintendo to check our accuracy. Every step of the way, like it's a collaboration between us and Nintendo. At this point, Dark Horse has done hundreds of these kinds of books. It takes dozens of people, sometimes even more than that, to create books like this, right? Books like an encyclopedia generally take somewhere between like a year and a half to 2 years to put together, because a lot of the time the licensor has to organize all of the assets, make sure that they're high resolution enough to go to print, We generally have, a point person on the side of the licensor who is sort of project manager on that side. And I'm working with them to figure all of those things out. One of the things that we really like to do is when we're hiring outside contractors to do writing for books of this nature, we try to hire a freelancer from the company that we're working with, right? Our main concern is creating as authentic an experience for the fans as we possibly can. And that means that we want the stories and the insights straight from the horse's mouth. We want to make sure that when we are presenting information, that it is the information that the people creating the games want presented. That's sort of the way that we approach things, is we want their story. It's not our job to sort of like create their story. What we want is to give them the ability to tell their own story.
Now, I will be fair and say that Patrick's knowledge is limited to the scope of the English versions. Neither he nor I claim to know the exact nature of the exchange between Nintendo and the Japanese publishing companies, and unless we can get Aonuma on the phone, we likely never will. I did, however, manage to find a decent amount of information on some of the people and organizations on the Japanese side. Obviously, I won't be able to cover every single individual because, first of all, that would take ages, and secondly, not everyone listed here has a strong internet presence. They might as well live on a different planet from where I'm standing. But we can at least put a face to the general collective, so we have a better understanding of who these people are and what their relationship to Nintendo as well as the Zelda franchise is. So the big players to keep in mind here are Shogakukan, Onbit Limited, and Takuma Shoten. Shogakukan is the publisher of Hyrule Historia, while Onbit is credited as the official publisher of all the other books that followed. I was initially a bit confused since the Wikipedia page for Encyclopedia as well as the Zelda wiki page for Creating a Champion credit Takuma Shoten, who are perhaps most well known in the West for Nintendo Dream Magazine, a sort of Japanese equivalent to Nintendo Power, but still active today. However, the books themselves clearly say that Onbit Limited is the official publisher.
Wikipedia? Using Wikipedia as your source of information?
It took me ages to find anything about Onbit, which wasn't helped by the fact that I don't read a single word of Japanese. But after a long search, I finally managed to track down one employee whose resume led me to a Japanese Wikipedia page about the company, as well as an official Twitter account. So here's the deal. Onbit Limited was established by a former editor-in-chief at Takuma Shoten, so it's basically an offshoot company. While they are two separate, independent companies, they do work closely together on various projects, like Nintendo Dream Magazine, for example. And Onbit's Twitter account goes on to explain that the sales of their publications are mainly outsourced to Takuma Shoten. Likewise, since 2011, Onbit has also started working on projects related to Shogakukan, and one of their employees was already involved in the creation of Hyrule Historia back in 2011 as well. Then we have Akinori Sao, one of the writers for Encyclopedia and Creating a Champion. He too was an editor-in-chief for Nintendo Dream Magazine years ago, but was already working freelance by the time he worked on the Zelda books. Over the past years, he's written various articles for Nintendo's official website, including the famous column Iwata Asks, in which the former president of Nintendo would sit down and talk to employees. Sao has conducted interviews with pretty much every big name out there, including Aonuma and Miyamoto, and according to his own biography, moved to Kyoto to be closer to Nintendo HQ. It's clear that the companies and freelancers who worked on these books all have connections to each other to some degree. More importantly, they all have a good, long-standing relationship with Nintendo, some spanning back decades. For example, Takuma Shoten also co-published the official Link to the Past guide from the 90s I talked about earlier, which, like I stated, is still considered canon. And even though Shogakukan was no longer involved in the Zelda art books after Historia, they do still produce other Nintendo licensed prints, like the official Breath of the Wild strategy guide. We have to remember that Nintendo is a video game company, not a book or magazine publisher. That's not their core business. So when a project like an art book or an official strategy guide comes along, they do what most companies do and outsource certain tasks to people and businesses who specialize in these fields, in this case print. But that doesn't mean that these people are given the freedom to do whatever they want. I think Patrick already demonstrated quite clearly that the notion that Nintendo was barely involved is factually incorrect. Not only did they provide all the assets, including raw text, but every word written, every image placement, every page design, everything was scrutinized, checked for accuracy, and ultimately approved by the company. And even if a specific text wasn't written by a Zelda staff member directly, there's still a good chance that they were at least interviewed about it. I suspect that most of the claims made about the book simply stem from a limited understanding about how books like these come to be, which is understandable if you don't work in this field. We tend to see the term writer or editor and draw all kinds of conclusions about their contributions, but the truth is that there's a lot of nuance to these job descriptions. The fact that a third party is credited as a writer or editor in these books doesn't really say much about the nature of the content itself, nor does it imply that they inserted their own ideas and opinions into it, or if they did, by how much. In fact, most professional writers are hired to put other people's ideas into words, or help improve readability, correct spelling and grammar, or refine the narrative structure to make it more engaging for the consumer. Usually it's not their job to write the lore. That is the author's job, in this case Nintendo. And as the author, they have full control over what makes it into the book and what doesn't.
Professional writers are good with words. They know spelling, grammar, story structure, all the rules of how to put them together and how to keep readers engaged. On the other side of this coin is the author. An author is someone who organizes an idea into a book format with the intention of putting it through a publishing process. Writing isn't even the author's job. They have their business that they're running. Writing a book is something they do to support their position within that business. Many authors, again, especially nonfiction, don't know spelling, grammar, story structure, or how to put all of those things together beyond the basics. They know the ideas that they want to teach and the impact that they want to make, but they don't really know how to put that impact into words that are going to sit on a bookshelf for the world to read.
Now, does that mean that every single word written in the books came directly from the minds of the Zelda team? I wouldn't go that far. I'm definitely open to the idea that there could have been some back and forth between the two parties. I'm not here to prove that the writers on the Japanese side gave absolutely zero input, because unless I can get into contact with one of them, I can't. But I can at least give you a more honest and accurate view on the matter. And from what I've learned over the past weeks, I think it's hardly warranted to call 50% or more of the book's content the product of a third party's imagination. I'd say a more realistic estimate would be that about 5% of the content could have been shaped or inspired by external input and suggestions. And that's being generous. Here's the thing though, if the contributions of an outsider who's not a core member of the Zelda team somehow diminishes canonicity, then we might as well start questioning the games as well. Because even here, contractors are not unusual. For example, the script supervisor for Breath of the Wild, the one responsible for the continuity of the story, is a freelance writer, not an employee working for the company. The important thing to take away from all this is that at the end of the day, as the author, Nintendo is the one who ultimately decides what makes it into the book. And when you read the interviews with Miyamoto, Aonuma, Fujibayashi and other staff members, it becomes clear time and time again that the books were made with their full cooperation, support and consent. And honestly, this should be the expectation. To suggest that the Zelda team simply gave up tons of precious information to some third party, information which prior to the books had never been released to the public, and then sat back as someone else potentially destroys their established lore, requires that we ignore how Nintendo as a company operates. We all know how protective they are about their intellectual property. Some might even say a little overprotective. Those who are dissatisfied with some of the content inside the books seem to suggest that the ones who made them probably didn't understand the lore very well, and that it would have been better if Nintendo had involved actual fans who have more experience with it. You know, people like me or other Zelda theorists, I guess. But those who worked on the books are fans of the games. Some of them have been collaborating with Nintendo on official Zelda projects since the late 80s. And as opposed to most fans like you and I, they have direct access to the people who made the games. They can interview them, ask questions, and request assets. A luxury most of us don't have, so safe to say, these really were the best people for the job. In fact, one of the things that struck me the most while talking to Patrick is just how much he knows and cares about the lore. He's been on board with the series ever since the original, and has lived and breathed Zelda lore for years while working on these books. For the localization of creating a champion, he personally fast-traveled to every single location mentioned in the book to do fact-checking. These are not just random people who are just doing a job without actually caring for the IP. Out of curiosity, I also asked about the translation process from Japanese to English, because I know it's something people often worry about whenever a localization takes place. This wasn't intended to be part of the script, but since it exists, I might as well show it to you, as some of you might find it interesting. The connection was a bit unstable during this segment, so there's a few sections at the beginning and end I couldn't really use. So to give a bit of context, Patrick starts out by explaining that the process begins with a translation program, a bit like Google Translate, but better.
What the program does is it gives you sort of a one-to-one translation of what this is, Japanese to English. And then what they do after that is they put human eyeballs on that translation, because obviously like context matters. And so we have human translators go through and give us a more accurate translation of that text. What we do from there is, I take a look at it, and my team, we have a couple of Japanese speakers at Dark Horse as well. We basically fact check everything that's in that text. For the encyclopedia, that meant going through, the text from all the video games. It means using all the resources at our disposal, a lot of which were provided by Nintendo, right? Just sort of like Excel sheets that have all the characters or the hardware that Link would use or the clothing or whatever else. And make sure that the translation matches, what the actual thing is, right? And a lot of the time, like they'll have the Japanese text next to the English text. And so we can just like reference them one-to-one. We can just look up a word in Japanese, and then what the English translation is will be right next to it. And so, in that case, we can be as accurate as possible.
So now let's take a quick look at some of the evidence used against the books. It goes without saying that I won't be able to cover everything ever said, so I'll just focus on the most common ones I could find. The first and probably most damning piece of evidence is the paragraph I briefly showed at the beginning. It's an excerpt found at the bottom of page 8 of the Zelda Encyclopedia and reads that, quote, "Where necessary, the writers of this book added their own interpretations and expanded upon the game's stories." And yeah, there's an argument to be made that this does indeed confirm that there was at least some speculation going on. However, there's also a flip side to this argument. First of all, the text doesn't say anything about how much of the content falls under the category of interpretation. It just says where necessary, so how anyone could derive actual numbers and percentages from this is beyond me. I also don't really see how this affects the legitimacy of all 4 books, since this paragraph is only found in Encyclopedia, but oh well. Secondly, I think I've already demonstrated that writer is a very loose term. And again, the text doesn't specifically say who did the interpreting. In many instances, Nintendo themselves are credited as both the author and writer. We don't really know who this is referring to exactly, because the entire book is one giant collaboration between many people, including the Zelda team. But there's a paragraph right above this one that may shed some more light on what exactly is being said here. It says that, quote, "Some elements at play behind early titles were not spoken of at the time of release, and interpretations of these first adventures of Link in Hyrule have evolved to include the context of later games." Just to be sure, I also checked with Patrick, and he confirms that the statements on this page were provided by Nintendo. It's basically just a reminder that, hey, sometimes there simply isn't enough information in the games themselves to provide indisputable facts. And it goes on to say that the events mentioned are subject to revision. And let's be honest, this shouldn't come as a surprise. The Zelda canon has evolved numerous times over the past decades. Before Skyward Sword, nobody knew where the Master Sword originally came from or how it was made. All we had was one vague statement from Twilight Princess about the ancient sages being involved somehow. So had a similar book like Hyrule Historia been released around this time, the book may have included a very different backstory for the Master Sword. Next is this statement made by Aonuma during an interview with Games Radar in 2017. Quote, "We published a book with a timeline, but we definitely got some comments from users saying, is this really accurate? I think this should be this way. It's different, and history is always kind of imaginative. It's left to the person who writes the book, so that's how we approach it as well. It's not necessarily that we come up with a game and think, oh, this is where it fits into the timeline." Some see this as an admittance that the books are a product of someone else's imagination, mainly because of this part of the statement. It's left to the person who writes the book. But if you look at what's being said here, it's obvious that he isn't referring to the Zelda books. It's a general statement about real-life history. We all know the classic saying, history is written by the victors. He feels that people questioning the accuracy of the Zelda books is only natural, and it should be this way because, just like real history, some of it is imaginative. In no way does he imply that the Zelda books were solely written by other people and thus shouldn't be taken seriously. If we're gonna use one specific quote from a staff member as leverage, I think it's only fair that I do the same. So in contrast, let's look at a few different statements made by a Zelda staff member about one of the books. Like this one from Fujibayashi found in the back of Creating a Champion. Quote, "There were backstories for particular settings during development, but they were very complex, so we couldn't explain them in the game. This book allows us the opportunity to tell those stories, which makes the development team and me very happy." Or how about this one from Aonuma in the back of Hyrule Historia? Quote, "I found myself wondering whether there was anything left we would be able to compile into a book. That's how The Legend of Zelda Hyrule Historia came to be. Or this one from Encyclopedia. Quote, "This encyclopedia is the fruit of all of our labor, showcasing how we've taken on all sorts of challenges. Of course, the reason that we're able to publish this sort of book or even make Breath of the Wild is because of the fans who supported us." Does any of this sound like they're not taking these books seriously? Or that it's just a group of outsiders making stuff up while the Zelda team sits back and does nothing to contribute? Everywhere you look, you see the same type of sentiment. We published a book. It allows us to tell those stories. Fujibayashi even stated that they do concern themselves with things like the timeline, because they know it's important to people. Speaking of the timeline, I want to quickly address one more aspect before I move on to the final segment. Namely, Aonuma's secret document which holds the true Zelda timeline. This is real, by the way. He actually said this in an interview with the UK's official Nintendo magazine, that there's a top secret document on his computer that only himself, Miyamoto, and Fujibayashi are allowed to see, and which allegedly holds the quote-unquote real Zelda timeline. This has led some to suggest that the timelines from Hyrule Historia and Encyclopedia are not the real deal, and are, again, the product of some third party. So basically, Aonuma is hiding the truth from us, that tricky bastard. What they don't seem to realize is that this interview was conducted in 2010, well over a year before Hyrule Historia was published. As much as I love a good conspiracy theory, I have to appeal to your sense of logic here. What do you think is the more likely scenario? That the Zelda staff would publish an official Zelda lore book with an incorrect timeline made up by some third party while secretly hiding the real one? Or that the secret document Aonuma is referring to here is simply one of the assets they were putting together in preparation for Hyrule Historia, which was set to release 1.5 years later? I will leave that up for you to decide. Now, with all that said, I do have to even out the playing field and say that even though it may not seem that way, given all I've said, I actually do agree to some extent with those who are critical of the books. I think labeling them as non-canon or trying to say that they shouldn't be taken seriously is definitely a step too far, but I do share the belief that the books should not be taken as a gospel on Zelda lore. And you know what? Nintendo agrees with you. There's a good reason why the books include so many phrases like "it is believed" or "it is said" or "it could be." The creators of the games have always made it abundantly clear that they want to encourage people to speculate, challenge ideas, or come up with their own, or look for new discoveries. Zelda canon is flexible, it always has been. It is shaped by both the creators of the games as well as the fans who interpret these stories years, even decades down the line. Aonuma himself explains that the gameplay is always at the forefront of development, and that the stories could be considered afterthoughts that often fall into place by chance. Even the official timeline has a footnote that states that it is subject to change based on new discoveries and the player's imagination. These are all reminders that some aspects of the lore are not set in stone and are a continuous puzzle that evolves over time. And yes, the books do indeed contain mistakes. And again, this really shouldn't come as a surprise. I mean, look at the size of them. With this amount of content spanning across 18 games, some of which were made in the 80s and 90s, no amount of double, triple, quadruple and tuple checking is going to filter out every oversight. Some arguments made against the books are downright petty, pointing out the smallest mistakes in the print as if it somehow proves the incompetence of those who put their hearts and souls into these projects. Like this one, for example, where they accidentally flipped the fire and the spirit medallion. This has been fixed in later editions, by the way, including mine, so it's not even relevant anymore, but there are definitely versions out there that feature this mistake. Now, look, I am one of the biggest Zelda lore freaks out there. It's become my job, pretty much. And even I accidentally mixed up 2 of the medallions in one of my videos. Mistakes happen. It doesn't mean the people who worked on the books are incompetent or didn't care. And Patrick himself can vouch for this. He's well aware of every mistake and oversight. As an editor working on books of this size, you kinda have to accept the fact that you'll never get everything right. These projects can't go on forever. They have budgets and deadlines. And let's not forget that every mistake is also one that Nintendo themselves failed to catch. As for inconsistencies in the lore itself, again, I have to ask, what did you expect? We all know that Zelda lore isn't perfect, and the staff will be the first to admit this. A book like Hyrule Historia, Encyclopedia, or Creating a Champion will never be able to give you all the answers, and they were never meant to. They are meant to enrich the world of Zelda, to tell stories the developers weren't able to tell in the games themselves, and sometimes these stories will be speculative. It's also worth considering that sometimes the creators themselves may not even remember the original meaning behind something they wrote years ago, which may sound weird, but it's more common than you think. Take for example my favorite band, Muse. In 2001 they released a song called Plug In Baby, and ever since then fans have been trying to find out what the lyrics and its title actually mean. In interviews, lead singer Matthew Bellamy changed up the story behind the song so many times that it only became more confusing. And when finally asked by a fan in front of a live audience, his ultimate answer was,
I can't remember now. What is it?
I read some book about, like, I don't know what it was, something to do with, my playing maybe, I don't know, I can't remember, sorry.
Was it,
When a piece of art or content wraps up, creators move on to new things and they don't always retain every detail behind the choices they made. Stories evolve, creators change their mind, and the bigger an IP gets, the harder it becomes to keep it all together and consistent. Even the best of the best in the industry make revisions and amendments to their work. The original story of The Hobbit was changed in later editions to make it more compatible with the story of Lord of the Rings. Some of the lore from the original Metroid Prime was altered for similar reasons. The Zelda games are no different. They too contain inconsistencies, retcons, contradictions, and localization differences. Some games even have two versions like Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, which have key differences in some of the dialogue and especially in their environments. So, which version is canon? The old one because it was the original vision of the creators? Or the new one where they may have had the opportunity to rethink certain lore aspects or make them more consistent with games that came after, like how they included the Happy Mask Salesman's backpack in Ocarina of Time 3D. I don't think one option is automatically inferior to the other. Both could and should be able to serve as evidence to support your theory of choice. So why can't the same thing apply to the books? Only sticking to one type of media has always struck me as a bit counterintuitive, because there was a time when printed material held the same value as the games themselves. They expanded upon all sorts of aspects the games weren't able to communicate, either because of technical limitations, time restraints, or because it would have padded out the game too much. Some of the most interesting parts of Breath of the Wild's story take place in creating a champion, things we would have never known about if it wasn't for the existence of this book, like the story of Akala Citadel, the evacuations of Central Hyrule, and many other interesting stories related to specific buildings or characters. As I mentioned at the very beginning, for the majority of Zelda history, we weren't even sure if Nintendo cared about Zelda lore or timelines. But after decades of silence, they opened up their archives and gave us an excessive amount of information, artwork, and ideas we never had access to before. I say, use that information. And if something doesn't add up, by all means, challenge it. Create your own theory, write a book, send it to Nintendo, I don't know. And maybe one day when a new game or book comes out, you may just see one of your theories become a fact. So next time someone references the Zelda Encyclopedia or creating a champion, don't simply hand wave it away or tell them to stick to the games. On the flip side, when someone challenges the lore inside the books, it's also worth listening because they may be onto something. Every discovery we make could potentially shape or inspire future books, games, timelines, maybe even movies. Limiting yourself to only one type of media, one language, or one idea goes against everything Zelda lore stands for. People have dug up the most obscure references, localization differences, beta elements, and so on. Some of it from the games, some from the books or the manuals or even interviews, all in search of ideas and inspiration. In conclusion, I feel like there's enough indications that the Zelda team was most definitely involved to a high enough degree to consider this a product of their making, and thus they are a canon addition to the series. But in true Zelda fashion, their contents are not indisputable and could be subject to change and revision in the future. To some degree it already has, seeing as the timeline from Hyrule Historia was made obsolete by Encyclopedia. You may have noticed that I haven't really touched upon specific lore details, like the infamous section in the Zelda Encyclopedia that talks about Majora's Mask being some sort of dream. I would have loved to triple the runtime of this video and talk about it, and oh, believe me, its day is coming. But I didn't want to turn this into a lore video, that wasn't my intention here. If I talk about one contradictory piece of lore, I have to talk about all of them, and this project was already getting out of hand. My goal was to show you more about how these books came to be and some of the people behind it. If you still believe the books are not canon, even after all I've said, that's fine. You do you. There is a thing called headcanon. Zelda is not like Star Wars or Lord of the Rings, where most things are explained and fleshed out in great detail. The adventures and backstories are purposely set up as ancient legends that may or may not be true, with a lot of gaps that require the imagination of the player. It's an endless puzzle that'll continue to introduce new pieces to work with, and the day we solve everything is the day that Zelda theories cease to exist. Let's hope that day never comes. And with that, I have said all I wanted to say on the matter. Thank you for watching the video. It goes without saying that a huge thanks goes to Patrick Thorpe from Dark Horse Comics, who's been at my side for the past weeks, answering questions and giving amazing insight into the work that goes into these projects. Another shout out goes to Rowan, who sent me these amazing miniature manuals of some of the games. Since I don't own a lot of the official manuals physically, it actually came in handy for the video, so thank you very much. There's a link to their Etsy store in the description in case you want to pick up one of these for yourself. As always, a big thanks to my supporters on Patreon and my channel members, and say hello to a few newcomers. It's Bats, Invade and Raid, Watermelon, Hugo Wolfsgaard, Thavist, Dill Pickle, Desecrated Cake, Brandon Eckel, and Alex SB. Thank you so much for joining. Also a special thanks to Chap.C for gifting me some of these new memberships. Now go and watch me scream like a little girl on one of his streams.
Go up, 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 up. Here's the stairs. No,
Yeah.
that's not up.
Yeah, I don't know where the stairs is.
I will see you all next time. This is Don signing off, and have a good one.